For many people, being able to keep a horse means that we are keeping our horses at a boarding facility. A boarding facility is a very common way to keep horses so that we can provide them all of their needs without actually having to own the land ourselves or build an arena or a barn or shelters or even have more than one horse. Boarding facilities are a fantastic way to be able to meet our horses' needs and to be able to have horses and enjoy horses without having to do all of these things ourselves and to build all of these things ourselves. Welcome to Season 5 of the Willing Equine podcast, the podcast all about creating positive relationships between horses and people. I'm your host, Adele Shaw, a certified equine behavior consultant, horsemanship mentor, and all-around horse lover. So boarding facilities are very common. They're very common in where I live in the United States. We see boarding facilities everywhere. I mean, I can drive down the road and I see within 5 minutes, I might have probably got 2 or 3 facilities that either are boarding facilities because they are like a training location, like a training facility, like they have a trainer there. They could either be discipline based, meaning they're like a hunter jumper competition barn, or they could be a barn that focuses on Western pleasure, or maybe it's more of a open style facility where you can bring your own trainer, basically have your own trainer come to you, or you're just a recreational rider that doesn't have a trainer, which I would, by the way, recommend that everybody have at least some form of coaching and training to make sure that they are able to help support their horse in the best way possible. Even if it's not super consistent, just making sure you're checking in with a professional that is checking, your posture and how you're riding and making sure your cues are staying consistent and continuing to work on your education, because it's a never ending process. You never just learn how to ride and then that's it. It's done. It's never like that with horses. And so it's extremely important that you continue your education, even if you only plan to ride occasionally on the weekends, or even if you're not riding all that often and you just need to be able to keep horses. It's really important to have somebody in your life that you can trust, that you can go to for training questions, training support, and so on and so forth. So some facilities are more open style where if you have a horse, you can keep your horse there and then you can have your trainer come in and work with you. So we don't have as many of those. We do have some, but the competition style barns are more common or just a resident trainer at the facility where you go to that facility to work with that resident trainer. And so everybody that's there works with that trainer. And so if you're keeping your horse there, you're in their training program, which is how it is at my facility too. If a horse is being boarded with me, they are in my training lesson program, meaning that the caregiver regularly takes lessons with me and has the horse in training with me. And so all of those setups are great. They're fine. But this is a really common thing. We have lots of boarding facilities around because not everybody is able to own a bunch of land and build an arena and build, a big barn and have everything, or have more than one horse. And so it makes it so that your horse can have their companions. They can have the room that they need. You can have your arena to train in. You can have the trails, access. You can have the barn and the shelter and all of that. And, while even, I live in Texas and a lot of people do keep horses in their backyard or on their property. There's a lot of property ownership here. And so there are a lot of privately owned facilities and horses in general. I mean, you can't go, 5 steps without running into a horse here. Pretty much it feels like, at least where I'm located in Texas. And, but we also have a lot of boarding facilities. And I know I've traveled to other locations, other areas of the world too, where there are similar setups, lots of boarding facilities. So today I want to talk about, because this is such a common thing, and I want to talk about ways to help your horse when you're in a boarding facility and maybe it's less than ideal. So it's not the perfect setup that you're looking for. You don't get to do it exactly the way you want to, which is pretty common. I mean, we all have our ideas of how we want to keep our horses, and we would have, option A is like our perfect, like everything is exactly the way we'd want it. And then a lot of times we have to settle for a little bit less than ideal when we're looking for boarding facilities, which is okay. And I want to preface this by saying that even if you have your own facility, and this will probably help a lot of you guys. I mean, I have my own place. I've had my own place for a very long time, and I've kept my horses with me, for quite some time. And it's not ideal. There's always more to do. There's always stuff I wish was a little bit different. Right now, my paddock system, the way I've got it set up, it's okay. We're working with it, but I really need more space for my horses to move. They need to be able to move more. It was never supposed to be long term. It was very short term the way I have it set up right now, so that, and while I built the rest of it, so I could just get the horses home and then I could continue to work on it. And one of the problems we ran into is that it was so exhausting bringing them home and getting them settled in that we haven't really continued to make much progress as far as putting up more fencing goes. And I want to do track systems, and I have all these plans. I have all these plans to make it my, quote, ideal, but it's not there yet. And there's actually a lot of, stuff that I'm running into that I don't feel like is ideal. And so, when you have your own facility, if you were to have your horses at home, if you were to be able to own all your own land and have your own boarding facility or private facility, I want you guys to know too, so that you can feel a little bit less dissatisfied and feel a little bit more content, that there's a lot of difficulties with having your horses at home. There's a lot of difficulties and challenges, unique challenges with having your horses home, and it's probably not going to be ideal. And there's going to be pros and cons to having them home. There's a lot of value in having your horses at boarding facilities and having other people that you can trust to take care of your horse, to feed your horse in the morning so you don't have to get there in the morning. If you're having a sick day, your horse is fine. At least I hope it's in a situation where it's fine for a day or two, that the horse is fine for a day or two, and you don't have to worry about them. They're still going to get their supplements. They're still going to get their food. They're still got their clean, fresh water, and they will be okay for a couple of days. When you have your horses home, unless you have staff or somebody that is helping you out, you don't have that. Like if you're sick, dying from the flu, it doesn't matter. You get up and you go do supplements and feed and clean the water troughs and fill the hay nets, and you are mucking the pastures, whatever. And I think that's a pretty obvious one, but there's also other struggles like financial limitations and just the sheer amount of time it takes to put in things like new fencing, or the cost. I think almost everybody underestimates the cost of fencing and running a facility and maintaining a facility that is safe for horses and also meets all of their needs. They are not an inexpensive animal to keep, and especially if we're trying to meet their needs. And this is, I'm not going to spend the whole episode. I don't want to keep talking about all of the pros and cons between boarding and keeping horses at home, but I want you guys to know that it's okay to be at a boarding facility that maybe isn't 100% ideal for what your, ideals would be, what you really want, for your picture perfect dream boarding facility. You're probably not ever going to find it. And also on top of it, there's, a lot of subjectivity in that. So one person's ideal is different from another person's ideal. And I know we could pull back and we could say, well, what's the horse's ideal? Even within that, there's still some flexibility and being subjective to the individual horse. So like one horse might really thrive on a track system and really need that. And with once a day feeding, with some supplements, and then 24/7 hay. I mean, that's pretty close to ideal, and that's for me. But there's another, I have a couple of horses that I struggle with. I'm going back and forth on whether or not a track system would be ideal for them because of the limitations in the space, and they have really severe resource guarding behaviors that show up in smaller spaces. But if they have big, wide open spaces with less fencing, they show a lot less of this agonistic type behavior towards their herd mates. And so these types of things, for that type of horse, the ideal for that horse would actually probably be a very, very big dry lot, or maybe if it was safe for that horse, they could be on pasture, which would actually be ideal. And I have a horse that's like that, where a big, a big pasture that isn't overgrazed, that is well maintained, and has rotational grazing would be ideal for this horse. She's not metabolic, and she would do best with her forage just being on the ground or up in the trees or wherever, just foraging for the forage rather than having like specific locations where the hay is offered. And she doesn't need me to watch the hay type quite so closely, and she'd be fine on some grass, some softer grass that is rotationally grazed and well taken care of. And she would not do nearly as well in like a track system with limited hay access. Even if I had like 1,000 locations for the hay, it would still be we could deal with it, we could cope with it, and we could figure it out, but it's not the ideal for that horse. So if we zoom out and we look at what's 100% like a thing that the horses need, that all horses need and is non-negotiable. And it's an ideal no matter the type of horse. This is where I think it's really important to focus our attention when we're looking at keeping our horses at boarding facilities or even at home, and deciding where to prioritize our efforts and deciding where to prioritize, which barn we're picking and where we would like to keep our horses and where we're going to put our money, where we're going to put our time. So if you've got a couple different boarding facilities to pick from, being able to zoom out and look at these non-negotiable ideals or non-negotiable requirements. These aren't even ideals, they're just requirements. This can really help with supporting our horses within the restraints of just life, right? There's just limitations to what we can and cannot offer our horses, and what's practical and what's not practical, and then what we can just do at this time in our life versus maybe what we can offer in 5 years. And it's okay to not be able to do everything 1,000,000,000% perfect 100% of the time. This is why I'm doing this episode, because I want to talk about what are the non-negotiables, what are the things that horses must have access to be able to thrive, or just be doing okay and just be doing well fairly decently. I mean, because in reality, we're even looking at domestic life for humans. It's a struggle for us to thrive in our domestic world and in just society. And so 100% we should be trying to get our horses to that thriving point and giving them the best lives that they can possibly have, and helping them do well in a day-to-day basis and be happy and healthy and just meeting all their species appropriate needs. But it's also a reality that things will never be 100% perfect, whether you have them at home or at a boarding facility. And so I want to talk about what are those non-negotiables, what are those things that we need to offer our horses that they cannot thrive without, and they can't even be doing okay without. Like they're in the barely surviving mode without these things. I want to talk about that. And then I also want to talk about being able to practice positive reinforcement type training. So clicker training, positive reinforcement focus training at boarding facilities. Because when you're at home in your own place, you can pretty much do whatever you want, which has its pros and cons. But that's really nice. The freedom there to be able to choose your training approach, choose how you're going to work with your horse, choose how you set up your management, choose how you approach behavior modification. All of that there's a lot of flexibility and freedom when you have your horses at home. However, when we're at boarding facilities, we have to work within the limitations or the restrictions that are set forth by the facility owners, and also out of respect for the other boarders, because we can't just have free reign and do whatever we want. And the reality is that these facilities, they have to handle larger quantities. It's not just you and your horse and you and your horse's needs. It's everybody's needs. And they're trying to do what's best for everybody, as long as they're good barn managers and good owners. That's what their goal is to meet everybody's needs while also still being able to run a successful business. They have to keep their doors open. This is really important. If they're not paying their bills, then they can't keep the doors open, and then you're out of luck either way. You either are struggling because they won't let you do something, or you're struggling because now you have to find a new facility, and you're also going to run into those same problems again. So we want to be very respectful of this and being mindful of that the people that we're working with and where we want to be taking care of our horses and that we're trusting with our horses are also that same thing is happening with at least a couple of other horses, if not larger quantities, like 20, 30, 40, 50 plus horses that they have to manage, and their owners, with all of their different ideals, with all of their different understandings of horse behavior and what are species appropriate needs, and on and on and on. Anyway, so let's go to the main topic, which is ways of helping your horse when you are working to fit into the structure of the boarding facility and the requirements that come with that. So some of the non-negotiables, let's start there. Really for me, and when we look at the science and we look at horses as a species and we look at their needs and we look at what's absolutely critical for their health and how they're designed and as a species, we've got forage is a big one. So forage is non-negotiable for me. When I'm looking at boarding facilities or I'm helping clients find a boarding facility, or one of the first things that I ask them to change when I show up for a behavior consult and they're at a boarding facility and this is not happening, is providing their horses with 24/7 access to forage. This is a little bit hard at a boarding facility, and I understand that hay is expensive. Hay is very expensive. Depending on where you are in the world, hay is very expensive. And it can be hard to come by good quality hay that doesn't just look good, but tastes good too. It's low in sugar, good protein, good mineral content, all of that. And it can be hard to get. Plus we've got just prices are rising like crazy. And so it's hard. And then also it can be very time consuming for the staff to fill up hay nets, to be constantly supplying hay. And then the horses waste a bunch of hay if it's just out and loose. And so I understand how culturally the equestrian community has really just not been very accepting of this idea of 24/7 hay. We have this idea of like, okay, the horse is either on pasture all the time and then probably a big pasture puff, meaning that they're probably overweight and obese because they're struggling with all the sugar in the grass because the pastures have not been properly maintained, or we have a metabolic horse, which is very common. Unfortunately, way more common than we want to than we used to think it was. And that many people are willing to accept. So a lot of horses are very sensitive, insulin sensitive to all of the sugars in grass, and we're not managing our land properly. We're not managing the grass properly. And I'm not asking boarding facilities to change their pasture management too much, because that is just a big thing. It takes a lot of land. Imagine 50 horses, like where I am in Texas, in this hill country. It's very rocky and our dirt and land quality is not super high. It's not meant for grazing livestock. And even then, we're not supposed to really graze livestock or graze horses like we graze cattle. But even still, the land here cannot hold, like they say, for a horse to survive, to have enough forage available on our land here, they probably need about 10 acres per horse. So if you're looking at these boarding facilities with 30 plus horses, that's a lot of land. That is a lot of land that has to be properly managed, and it's very expensive to manage correctly. So it's a much better approach most of the time where I am to not do pastures. We can do big paddocks and dry lots and or even like track systems. Perfect. And we can manage those. There's a lot more cost effective in management wise. And then to supply hay. And that's really what we do here. We do a lot of hay. And so if we can find some good quality hay and pay the money for it, we can do that. And then I usually recommend like a slow feeder net of some kind. Now this can be done safely. Even with shod horses, we can figure out how to trickle feed them and we can offer them this safely. It is preferred that they eat closer to the ground. Sometimes we can do this with like water troughs, like empty old water troughs. We can put the hay inside of that and keep their feet out of the net. So there's options here. There's a lot of options when it comes to being able to offer your horse slow-fed hay in a safe way that is appropriate for the individual horse. And when I'm talking slow feeder, I'm talking like the hole size on the net should be, it depends on the horse. Like my guys are on currently right now either 3/4 of an inch or an inch, and they don't go any bigger than an inch because they will just blow up like balloons. But sometimes I start horses off on 1.5 inches and then we work our way down, or 1 3/4 inches and work our way down. But nothing ever is bigger than that, and it's usually only short term that they're on that big of an opening before we work our way down. So, but when it comes to boarding facilities, let's wrap back to there because I'm primarily focusing on the individual horse owner that's boarding at a facility. We have to keep in mind that all of these different boarders have different ideas of what their horses should be eating. And there's a limitation on how much hay the staff can just be throwing at your horse. And there's a lot of labor that goes into managing hay and making sure the hay never runs out. So it's understandable when boarding facilities are a little bit about just throwing hay bales out there, right? And there's a lot of preconceived ideas about this too, big hay bellies, fat ponies, just on and on and on. So what I often recommend for people to do is to talk to their boarding facility about paying either extra for hay or bringing in their own hay and then filling up their own hay nets and then supplying, especially if your horse is staying in their own space, in their own stalls or their own paddocks. Or maybe they can go out with a couple of other horses where their owners are also on board with more forage. And you can figure out a system where you guys take turns to fill up like bigger hay nets. You can get full square bale nets. You can get 3-string square bale nets. And you can also get round bale nets, and these can last quite a bit of time. And if they just never run out, this is a good way to be able to offer your horse 24/7 forage, while also making sure that you're not adding extra labor onto the barn and that you're paying for the extra use of hay. So this would be one of those non-negotiables is the supply of 24/7 forage. The horses need forage around the clock. They need access to forage around the clock. So that's when you're looking at where to board your horse, that's going to be one of the first things that I ask. That's going to be one of the first things I would encourage you to ask about is how is your horse getting forage 24/7? How are we going to do this? What can we work out? What is good for you? What is good for me? It doesn't really matter. We'll figure it out, but my horse has to have 24/7 forage. That's a non-negotiable. The other thing that's a non-negotiable is making sure that my horse is never alone. Now, I'm not saying that they have to be in a pasture with another horse. They don't have to share a paddock with another horse and actually in a lot of situations, the coming and going of horses in boarding facilities, the frequent, they have this companion for a couple weeks and then that one leaves. And then they have this companion for a couple months or even a year and then that one leaves and just back and forth and back and forth. Or it's a big herd of 20 horses and horses are just randomly introduced and taken away. That can be extremely hard on horses and can create a lot of separation anxiety and create a lot of just grieving and trauma there because their companions are just being ripped away at random. And this is kind of a natural part of boarding facilities, unfortunately, because you can't control what all the other horses are doing. Sometimes even just going off to the arena, for a lesson can be very stressful for your horse that's left behind. So one of the things I like to talk to people about that's a non-negotiable is can they have at least companions on the other side of the fence and a couple of them, and they're never all gone at the same time? So, for example, if you had your horse was in a big paddock and then there was a paddock to the right and a paddock to the left and then maybe even a paddock behind them, probably is a pretty solid bet that at least one of those horses will be left and will be able to stay with your horse on the other side of the fence while the other two go to do a lesson or go off to a show or something like that. Or if for some reason all three are gone, that your horse is brought into the barn or brought somewhere else where they can see other horses, but they're just never totally left alone. That's really, really important. Or potentially something else that you could talk to them about and look into is maybe your horse stays with the long-term resident that's a senior that never really gets ridden anymore. Maybe it's a retired lesson pony that's just there to be retired and never goes anywhere, never does anything, and is just there. That's a really good setup actually, because especially even if they could share a paddock, that would be great because then maybe the barn staff would be fine if you offered that pony enrichment while you worked with your horse or you brought them both into the barn together. Those are really good setups if you can arrange them. Sometimes it's not possible, but if something like that shows up, fantastic. And you could maybe even kind of replicate that with finding another boarder at that facility that is of like mind, that has a similar ideas around not leaving horses behind, not putting them through a lot of unnecessary stress. Maybe even they're on board with the 24/7 forage and maybe they can board together. That's an idea too. But having companions, even if it's on the other side of the fence, is a non-negotiable. So when you're looking at boarding facilities, and this is going to be another really critical one that can help make your horse's life a whole lot better and help improve the overall experience, their day-to-day life, and help them thrive is having those companions, especially steady companions, not just random horses that come and go, and then having that 24/7 forage. So those are two non-negotiables. The third one is, we'll kind of put two things together. I'm going to say they're a bit of a given, but you'd be surprised at how many times I hear stories where these two things are not a given. So I'm going to talk about them. Fresh water constantly. They should never run out of water, and access to shelter of some kind. If they're coming and going from a stall, so they're getting, they're being stalled at night and they're turned out during the day. Of course, we would love lots of turnout, but that works as a shelter for bad weather, etc. That's fine. We'll talk about turnout more in a second. So shelter, access, away from extreme heat, away from extreme weather. I like where they can choose. They can choose if they want to be in the shelter or not. I think that's the best setup possible, but I understand that that's challenging to find in boarding facilities. And then also sometimes there is a shelter, but there's too many horses in that pen area, or one horse really resource guards that shelter. And so that's also going to be a difficult situation because your horse doesn't really have access to shelter if that's the case. So having shelter that they actually have access to is important. And then the water that they never run out of and stays clean. I would talk to the boarding facility, ask them how often they clean out the water. What's their policy on when, the water, just all of the things having to do with water, and making sure that stays clean and is readily available at all times. And I would also see if you can make sure, if your horse is going to be with other horses out in the pasture, that maybe there's more than one access to the water. So there's not any hogging or resource guarding of the water. That's kind of going into that ideal, it would be nice. But that's something else to consider too, is where is the water? How accessible is it? Is it a very small space that they have to fight over? Is there plenty of it? Is there multiple locations that can help improve that experience for your horse too? All right, turnout is another non-negotiable. Turnout of some various amount. The more, the better. My guys stay out 24/7. They are never stalled except for 5 to 10 minutes during breakfast, and maybe a little bit in the afternoon or during the day when I'm doing training sessions, but they always have hay and water with them. But they have 24/7 access to moving around. It could be in a dry lot. It doesn't have to be in a pasture. You don't have to put your horses on grass. It's more about getting the movement. It's more about being able to just keep their legs moving. This is very, very important for their health, for their joint health, for their gut health, for their mental health. It's very important for them to move. Now, you're going to probably be in some locations hard pressed to find a decent sized turnout area. Even if they do get turnout, sometimes it's a very small space. The bigger, the better. But not even so much about size as it is about enriching level. So for my turnouts, they're on a really big hill. There's lots of trees. The hay is at the bottom of the hill, the water and the shelter at the top of the hill. And there's rocky areas and there's treed areas, and they can move in and out, and they can go exploring, looking for little growths of, this or that here and there. It's mostly dry lot, but they can look for stuff that's growing, and sometimes they find stuff. I also scatter hay and enrichment activities around, and that encourages them to move. But that type of turnout, even though it's not a super big space, it's not acres and acres, is actually more beneficial than putting them on just a big, flat, boring space where they just walk a circle near the gate all day or walk the fence line and don't really do anything other than that. So more enriching with more variability in the terrain and what's in the enclosure is going to be extremely important. Something that's going to encourage your horses to move is really important. And of course, having the space. So a little 24/24, I don't consider that turnout. That's just a large stall. The arena, it can be fine too if they move around, if they are, exploring objects. You put some enrichment out there, get them moving, and they spend time out there. That's fine. That's going to be adequate for some horses in some spaces, especially if that just helps them get more turnout. Maybe they have some pasture turnout for a couple of hours, but you're trying to get them some more. Putting them out in the arena for a couple of hours or even 30 minutes is fine. Adding that to their day every day, that can be really beneficial. But the more turnout they can have, the better. Even if your horse is a big show performance horse, even if they've got to be ready for the show this weekend and you don't want them nicked up or, whatever, Turnout is best, and you will actually be surprised that you might be surprised that you will see a decrease in injuries and a decrease in behavior problems if your horse is turned out. My horses are, like I said, 24/7 turned out. They're never stalled. And while they're not big show performance horses, although one is a retired one, we, knock on some wood, but we almost never sustain any injuries. The biggest problems I run into is we get a little bit of sun bleaching every once in a while, which nutrition often is a factor in, and we've been working on. But then the only other thing that can happen, sometimes they rub on the trees and they get a few scratches from the trees because they just are really plowing into those trees, itching on them when they're itchy. That can happen as well. But, the herds are stable. There's not a lot, and their resources are very well spread out, and there's plentiful resources. They never run out. There's lots of access to water, lots of access to hay. The herds have been with each other for a very long time. There's lots of space for them to move away from each other. There's no trap points and little, areas that one will get pinned into. And so there's not lots of bites and kicks and anything like that. And there's no, suspensory injuries and ligament injuries because they're used to it. And my ground is rough and we're on big hills and they sprint around and they're just doing all kinds of stuff. And I would recommend if your horse has been stalled for a very long time and isn't used to that kind of turnout, that kind of environment, I would introduce them gradually. Don't throw them out there overnight and expect them not to get injured. But over time, you can work up to it. And I think you'll be pleasantly surprised how much better they do, how much more they're thriving, and how few injuries you'll see. When I had horses stalled all the time and I kept them, wrapped up at night and stalled at night, and they had a couple hours of turnout during the day and nice manicured pastures and all that. Oh my gosh, the amount of injuries we dealt with on a daily basis was incredible. And these were very well-bred show horses. And it was just an ongoing nightmare. So, and now life is just totally different when it comes to that stuff. So that is something, to really think about, is that turnout is incredibly important for their health and a non-negotiable. Now, how much turnout is going to vary a lot, and the size of the turnout is going to vary a lot. And I'm not going to give you a hard, fast number. I'm just going to say as good as you can get it. As much turnout as you can find. That's what you're looking for. So the non-negotiable is that they need turnout. The variable here is how much turnout. And I'm going to say that it's just as much as you can find. If you are looking at 20 different barns, that's a lot. But let's say 10 different barns. If all three are meeting the other things, the hay, the water, the shelter, the companions, and it comes down to turnout, pick the one that has the most. Even if that means you have to give up the arena size or a covered arena, or that means you have fewer trails to go on or something. Turnout is really, really, really important. So that's going to be that non-negotiable. Thanks so much for listening. If you have any questions, please do email me at info@thewillingequine.com. If you'd like more information on my courses, coaching, consulting, or even access to free resources, please do check out my website, thewillingequine.com. If you like this podcast or this episode, please do leave feedback on the platform that you listen to it on.